Let's now talk about another type of function in C++, the programmer-defined function. When we say programmer-defined function, these are functions that we write ourselves, as opposed to a predefined function that are already built in a C++ library. Talking about programmer-defined functions, there are two components of a function definition. First, there is the function declaration or the function prototype of the programmer-defined function that we would like to write. When we say function declaration, this is the part which shows how the function is called. And the function declaration must appear in the code before the function can be called. The point is, we can't use or call a function that has not been declared. Here's the syntax of a function declaration. First, we have the type returned, or the data type that is returned by the function, or shall we say the output of the function. And we also have the function name, and we must take note that when naming a function, we follow the same rules that we follow when we declare a variable. Whatever rules that we follow when we name a variable, the same applies when we declare a function. And of course, we also have the parameter list, and it should be terminated by a semicolon, just like declaring a variable. And of course, to guide whoever is reading your source code, you can also put a comment which will describe what your function does. After your function declaration, you can now write your function definition. What the function definition does is it describes how the function does its task. It can appear before or after the function is called. And the standard syntax to write a function definition is the following. Just like your function declaration, you need to indicate the data type that is being returned by your function. And of course, your function name and your parameter list, exactly the same as what you have written in your function declaration. After which, you have the following block which would contain your function body, or the codes which would tell your compiler how your function should work. Let's talk about the function declaration in more detail. As you have seen in our example, the syntax shows us what the function should return as well as the data type. And of course, the function declaration also tells the name of the function. In the function declaration, we also see how many arguments are required. And just like your variable declaration, those arguments also need to have a data type, which are also shown in your function declaration. And of course, it also shows the formal parameter names. Talking about formal parameters, they are like placeholders for the actual arguments used when the function is called. So when we say arguments, these are the values that are being passed to your function when they are called. And when we say parameters, parameter names are the part in which you are declaring the variables, which will contain the arguments that will be passed to your function whenever it is called. As you can see, parameter names are seen in your function declaration as well as in your function definition. And as we have mentioned a while ago, parameters are declared just like a variable. Therefore, they should also be a valid identifier. Here's an example. As you can see here, we declared the function total cost with return type double, and inside our parameter list, we have the following parameters with their respective data types. And take note that whenever we write our function declaration, it should always end with a semicolon. And if necessary, it would be helpful to include a comment which describes what our function does. Next, let's talk about function definition in detail. If we will recall, what the function definition does is to provide the same information as the declaration, whereas we see the return type, the name, and the argument list of a function. For example, we have the following definition for the function that we declared a while ago. As you can see here, we have the same return type and function name, as well as the parameter list that will be required by the function later when it is called. Basically, this part, which contains your return type, function name, and parameter list, is called your function header. And below it is our function body, which contains all the statements that would be executed whenever our function is called. Take note of this part. As you can see here, we have the return keyword and of course an expression which performs the following computation. So what does the return statement do? Whenever our compiler sees the return statement, it means that it is the end of our function call. Then it returns the value calculated by the function. In our case, the function total cost is returning the result of the expression right after the keyword return, just like this one. In this case, the expression performs the calculation that we indicated in our programmer defined function. Also, the expression can also be a variable which contains the calculated value. Here's an example of how we can use the return keyword to end a function call and pass whatever is the result of the computation inside our function body. How about the function call? In this case, what the function call does is it tells the name of the function that we would like to use. And also, in accordance to our function declaration, it lists the arguments that are required. It is used in a statement where the returned value should be used. Here's an example. In this particular function call, whatever is the result of this computation inside our function body will be returned and assigned to this variable. Of course, since this variable is of data type double, it is expected that this function also has a return type of double, just like this example. In this case, we have the following function declaration. As you can see here, following the syntax, we have the return type, the function name, and inside the parentheses, our argument list. In this case, they are declared as parameters, each with their respective data type. And of course, it is terminated with a semicolon. And of course, especially if you are writing quite a complex function, it would be useful if you put a comment which describes what the function does. Although in this case, since this is just an example, then comments will be not that important since this is just a short program. But anyway, here's the first part of our function, which shows our function declaration. And of course, following the standard syntax, we have the return type, the function name, and of course, the parameter list. And of course, a function declaration should be terminated with a semicolon. And take note that a parameter list is actually just like a variable declaration. In this case, we have two arguments for our program, for our function, and they are separated with comma. And of course, this is our main function or the body of our main program. And as you can see here, this is the part where the function total cost is being called. As you can see here, what happens is that we declared the following variables, and later on, they will be provided with values using the following cin statements, and whatever value was provided in the form of user input, they will be passed in the form of arguments during the function call. Again, variables that are passed whenever a function is called are called arguments. And of course, these arguments will be passed to our formal parameters. As you can see here, formal parameters are the variables that we indicate in the declaration and definition of our function. As a result, whatever values were passed into our function during our function call in the form of arguments will be passed in the following formal parameters. And of course, the formal parameters are the one that will be used inside our function body, just like what we have here. Which means whatever value is contained in our argument when our function was called will also be passed to the following variables inside our function body, and therefore will be used in this expression, which will also be returned in this statement. And also, whatever is the result of this return statement will be passed to this variable. You can look for this sample program and you can run this by yourself so you can see how it works. And here's a sample run. Here's a little detail about function calls. In this case, the values of the arguments are plugged into the formal parameters, and these are called call by value mechanism with call by value parameters. In this case, the first argument is used for the first formal parameter, which means the value that is contained in the argument that is passed in our function call will be passed to the formal parameter in accordance to its function declaration and definition. Also, the value plugged into the formal parameter is used in all instances of the formal parameter in the function body, as we have seen in the previous example. Here's a sample trace of what is going on whenever we call a function and pass an argument to it, as well as what happens to those arguments as they are passed into the function's formal parameter. You can take a look at this and explore how it works. Talking about function declaration, we also have alternate declarations. There are two forms to do function declaration. First is to list the formal parameter names. The other one is to list the types of formal parameters but not names. Although the first one would aid in the description of the function in comments. We have the following examples. In the first example, we declared our function as well as indicate the data type and name of our parameters. In the other example, we simply indicated the data type of our formal parameters. Of course, function headers must always list formal parameter names. Here's an example why it is important. First is the order of arguments. The compiler will check that the types of the arguments are correct and in the correct sequence. However, the compiler cannot check that arguments are in the correct logical orders. This is why it is important that we must indicate the name of our formal parameters to avoid confusion on our part, which would result into logical error. Let's take a look at the given example. For instance, we have the following function declaration. It has the return type of character. Here's our function name. And here is our parameter list. As you can see here, they both have the integer data type. And for example, we would like to assign the following values into our formal parameters. Hence, they will be passed as arguments, which will also be plugged into our formal parameters. As you can see here, this function call is actually correct. Correct in the sense that it does not violate any C++ syntax. But if you look closer, they are actually in the wrong order. As you can see here, this argument is actually referring to the value that will be passed into this formal parameter. On the other hand, this argument is supposedly for this formal parameter, which is the first one. This would produce a faulty result because the arguments are not in the correct logical order. However, our compiler will not see that as an error. Here's a sample program that would demonstrate this scenario. Of course, you can take a look at that in this particular sample program. So I expect you to run that so you will be able to see how this works. Going back to the function definition syntax, it is already understood that it is a function definition which contains the declaration of variable which would use the formal parameters that you declared in your function declaration. Within a function definition, variables must be declared before they are used. Also, variables are typically declared before the executable statements begin. At least one return statement must end the function. Although not all functions return a value. We will talk about more of that as we progress. Here's a syntax for a function that returns a value. Anyway, this is already clear to us. As you can see here, we simply need to indicate the return type of our function if it is expected to return a value. As we can see here in our function declaration, we indicated the return type. Same also with our function definition. And of course, we also have to put a return statement inside our function body, just like what we've seen in our previous examples. So how do we properly place our definitions? Of course, a function call must be preceded by either the function's declaration or the function's definition. If the function's definition precedes the call, a declaration is not needed. That is in the case wherein you placed your function definition at the top of our program. Therefore, it precedes the part where the function was actually called. If that's the case, then we don't have to write a function declaration. Placing the function declaration prior to the main function and the function definition after the main function leads naturally to building your own libraries in the future. And of course, that is the recommended practice. We now know how to write a function declaration and a function definition for a programmer-defined function. And of course, to do that, we also need to understand what formal parameters are, as well as what arguments are and how they are properly used.